teacher wrote this, and I quote her in my book. She said, when girls were behind, which was not that long ago, Title IX was for girls, and 1994, the Gender Equity Act poured millions of dollars into equity workshops and girl-friendly curriculum and so on. There's been nothing like that for boys. And so this teacher said, reflecting what she's getting, in the world of teachers, she said, when girls were behind boys, we said, well, it's the system, it's discrimination against girls. Now that boys are falling behind, we say it's their fault.
It's because, yes.
For being too masculine. That's what she said. Well, it's boys' fault because, because of their masculinity, they won't sit still, they won't pay attention, they're too aggressive, blah, blah, blah. So she said, we're blaming boys for their masculinity.
On the word of God, I will build my house. I will build my house.
Welcome to Grounded. I'm Steve Hartland, pastor of Cornerstone Community Church in Joppa, Maryland. And I have a guest on Grounded today. Her name is Professor Nancy Pearcey. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She is scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. Houston. I've never been to Houston. Wonder how many of you have been to Houston. I'd love to go to Houston, I think. Anyway, she's author of at least 9 books. It says 9 on Wikipedia, so it must be true, right? And I first ran into her. I didn't bring the date with me. I didn't bring the book with me, but she wrote a book titled Total Truth. It's a book on Christian apologetics, defending the faith, a really excellent book. I highly recommend it to you. I've recommended it to other people. But that was my first brush with Professor Pearcey. And since then, there have been other books that came out. But we're talking with her today about her most recent book. And here it is. I'm going to show it to you. And the title is The Toxic War on Masculinity. Being a guy, that interested me. How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. So we're here to talk about that. Nancy, say hello to everybody, would you?
Yes, I will. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure. Cool that we can do this. I'm in Maryland, you're in Texas, and we're talking live. Modern technology, a blessing and a curse. So let's get a little bio first, just so people can get to know a bit about you. So what do you want to tell us about your background? Where were you born and raised and stuff like that?
Well, when I'm asked about my background, I usually like to just tell the story of how I became a Christian because it's such an important part of my life. So I was raised in a Lutheran home. I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran.
Yes.
All Irish Catholic.
Yes.
So my father was Swedish, my mom's Norwegian. So, but part of the problem with ethnic homes is that often they rely on the ethnicity to hold their kids instead of really having a strong personal commitment to the faith. At any rate, when I was in high school, I just started asking my parents questions. How do we know it's true? That's all I was really asking. How do we know Christianity is true? I'm at public high school. All my textbooks are secular. All my teachers are secular. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to know, how do we know that Christianity is the truth? And unfortunately, none of the adults in my life could answer that question. I asked a college professor point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me.
Oh, man.
And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and I thought, well, I get something more substantial from him. But all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes.
They all need to read your book, Total Truth.
Yeah, that's why I wrote Total Truth, right?
Yes.
Because I wanted to address young people who had the questions that I had and who didn't get answers. And so I did. I totally left my religious upbringing very intentionally, walked away from my faith at about midway through high school. And I started going to the library and pulling books off the philosophy shelf because I thought, if I can't get any, adults to talk to me about these issues, maybe that's what philosophy is about. That's their job, right? To answer questions like, is there truth? How can we know it? Is there meaning to life? Is there foundation for ethics? Or is it just true for me, true for you? And I realized pretty quickly that if there was no God, then the answer was no. There is no meaning to life. There is no foundation for ethics. And I realized there's not even a foundation for knowledge because here's how I thought of it. If all I have is my puny brain in the vast scope of time and space, what makes me think I could have some sort of transcendent, absolute, objective truth? Ridiculous. That's how it struck me as a 16-year-old. Ridiculous. So by the time I graduated from high school, I'd become a complete relativist and skeptic and even determinist, because in my science classes, I was taught that we were just complex biochemical machines anyway, with no free will. So I was very ripe for a few years later. I ended up at L'Abri, which is the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. It's in Switzerland. I had lived in Europe as a child, and so I had gone back. I loved it. And so that's how I kind of stumbled across L'Abri. And that's the first time I'd ever heard any Christians talk about apologetics, give good reasons and arguments for faith, and could engage the secular isms that I had absorbed by that time. No other Christian had been able to do that. So I was blown away. I was incredibly impressed. And of course, Francis Schaeffer is also known for promoting the arts among Christians. And I was in Germany studying at the Heidelberg Conservatory. I play the violin.
I didn't know that about you.
So that was important. And then this was 1971. And so everyone there was hippies. And even that was impressive, because nobody at that time no Christians had yet figured out how to reach across that cultural divide, to these disaffected young people. And so I thought, who are these Christians? They can even talk to hippies. At any rate, so that's the big story of how I became a Christian. It was through discovering apologetics, and that's why I write and teach on apologetics now. As I said before, I just really have a heart for young people who are having questions, and so all of my books are directed in some way towards answering their questions.
Love it. Absolutely love it. I'd like a little more bio, if I may, please. Just personal stuff like married, kids, do you have a dog or canary or what?
Yeah, so I'm married. I have 2 kids. And fortunately, one of them was able to attend HBU, where I teach now. He had just reached college age. So we homeschooled both of our kids, at least for part of the time. Our oldest son was homeschooled at a time when there were no high school homeschools. It was early on, so he did end up going to public high school. But the fun about having my second son attend my university is I felt like I was still homeschooling, because I made him take all my courses.
He didn't mind being under mom's shadow, so to speak, and mom's watching me.
This son, no. This, every child is different, of course, but he's a very sweet-natured person who I think was happy to have a little extra time.
Nice.
So
nice.
Yeah, that's anything. Well, I play the violin. You already got that part. So
I asked about a dog or a canary, but I was only kidding. But you can tell us if you have one.
Oh, our dog recently died, so actually we're in grief right now.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I understand that grief. Our last, I think we had 5 dogs or something. Our last one died 16 years ago. His name was Boaz. He was a black Labrador retriever. And we loved him so much. For that and other reasons, we have not seen fit to get another dog since then.
That's it, isn't it?
Yeah.
You almost feel disloyal or something if you get another
he's our
dog.
final dog.
Boaz is a cool name for a dog, by the way.
It was. It was even a conversation starter.
I bet.
Or people would say, they'd meet us, hey, what's your dog's name? Boaz. Oh, are you Christians? That was kind of fun. They knew about Boaz.
Christian or Jewish, right?
That's right. Very good. Well, let's jump into things that are related to your book. So I'd like to start here, if you don't mind. And that is, that we're hearing now that evangelical Christian men are awful. They're just oppressive, patriarchal, prone to abuse their wives and everybody else. But in your book, I noticed you make the claim, the kind of surprising claim, that actually if you test this, if you look at the data, if you look at the studies, those men, evangelical men who actually attend church, I think it is, have the lowest levels of abuse and divorce. You want to talk about that? Is that true?
Yes. I put that at the front of the book because I wanted to get the good news out first. And it was very easy to find people attacking Christian men for being, like you said, abusive, tyrannical patriarchs, overbearing, controlling. And I'll give you just one. Here's one quote. It was from the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement.
Huh.
And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture.
Oh,
that
yeah,
we,
the rape culture. Yeah.
that we see permeating American Christianity today.
Permeating. Wow.
Yeah, so that's pretty strong. And what happened is the social scientists were reading these accusations and saying, "Where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data?" And so they went out and did the studies. So psychologists, sociologists, I cite some dozen or so studies. And what they found out was the exact opposite of the media narrative, that evangelical men actually test out as, like you said, the most loving husbands, the most engaged fathers. And by the way, they are interviewing the wives. So they're actually saying that the wives report
That's what the
being
wives
the
say.
happiest, which is important, right? And they do interview the wives separately because
So she can really say what she believes.
I mean, people do often say, this surprised me how many people push back by saying, well, of course their wives said they were happy. Their husband's sitting right there. But actually, that's not the case. Most of these studies drew on these large public databases. The largest one is called the General Social Survey, and it's done by the University of Chicago. And it's something that people pull from who are, journalists, policymakers, politicians, social scientists, and so on. So, yeah, the women are actually interviewed separately. And so these wives report being the happiest with their husband's expression of love and affection. Evangelical fathers spend more time with their kids than any other group, both in terms of shared activities like sports and church youth group, but also in terms of discipline like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples do, as you said, divorce at a lower rate than any other group, 35% lower than secular men. And also the biggest surprise was that their rate of domestic abuse and violence is the lowest of any group in America.
Now, let me jump in there a second, especially on the divorce front. Aren't we hearing, though, that, evangelicals are divorcing just at the same rate as everybody else?
Yeah. And of course, I get that all the time. So then I have to explain. The researchers went back to the data and they did separate out evangelical men who are really authentically committed, go to church and so on, from nominal Christian men.
Yes.
And previous studies had not done that. So nominal, by the way, my students don't even know what the word nominal means. So I have to explain. NOM is Latin for name. So it means in name only. So these are men who, on a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example. But they don't actually go to church. It's their family background. It's their cultural background. And these men test out shockingly different. So they do test out with all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness in their marriage. They are the least engaged with their kids. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular men. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, higher even than secular men. And so this is why the numbers are so often misleading. If you have, if you just have a study covering evangelicals, you'll get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. So of course the numbers are going to be misleading. And by the way, and this is not out there in the public yet. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this, and which is one reason I put it right at the front of the book, because people need to find this out. Christians need to know, the Christian men are actually doing very well.
Yes.
Because we tend, Christian men are feeling the same sense of attack on masculinity. When I told my class at Houston Baptist University that I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Oh, yeah.
So I thought, Christian men need to hear
Even
this.
Even a college-age young man is feeling that.
Yes, and one of my graduate students is the leader of a women's ministry at a large Baptist church here in Houston. And here was her story. She said, because we meet with the leadership and we decide how to handle Mother's Day and Father's Day. On Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better.
I
Okay,
think I'm glad I'm not going to that church on Father's Day.
but I hear from a lot of people. Oh, yep, that pretty much describes our church. So I was very careful not to take a scolding tone
Hmm.
in this book because I
Mhm.
feel like it's time to start, building up Christian men and letting them know that they are doing a very good job.
Excellent. So one important, very important part of your book, a lot of what comes later in the book is going to point back to this or grow out of this. And that is you talk about men being torn between or men being offered or men being raised up in two competing scripts for masculinity. You could be masculine in this way, you could be masculine in that way. Would you talk about those? Because I thought they were really foundational to a lot that's in the book and really full of insight.
Yeah, I love this. It was a sociological study, and I'll give you some background to it, which is not in the book. This has proved to be the most controversial book I've ever written, which
No
surprised
surprise.
me.
Oh, yeah?
Well, my earlier book, Love Thy Body, dealt with abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is, of course, an issue that's exploding right now. So I did not think masculinity would be more controversial. But I taught the manuscript in several classes, and I tend to lead a lot of reading groups on my books to get feedback, rub off the rough edges.
Hmm.
And so they would tell their family and friends about the book. And invariably, the first question would be, whose side is she on?
Whose side is she on? Huh.
With that tone, right? Who's
Huh.
kind of a hostile tone?
Uh-huh.
Whose side is she on? And by the way, the second question was always, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway?
Oh, no. Yeah.
And so men tended to assume I was going to be a male bashing feminist. And more progressive people tended to assume I was going to be some kind of angry, defensive reactionary.
Hmm.
And so I actually put this study at the front of the book as well. It's to sort of overcome that initial hostility or suspicion. And the study was done by a sociologist who gets invited to speak all around the world. And so he came up with this really interesting experiment where he would ask young men two questions. First, he would ask them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. They would say honor, integrity, duty, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And the sociologists would ask, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. And if they were in a Western country, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with a second question. He said, what if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain. What else? Be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language.
Uh-huh.
In other words, it appears that all around the world, even in countries that have no Christian background, young men do know what it means to be the good man. It seems to be an inherent, innate knowledge. I would say they're made in God's image. And they do inherently know what it means to be a good man. But they also then feel this cultural pressure to be the real man, quote unquote, which are the traits that are somewhat more toxic. And certainly if disconnected from a moral ideal, they can slide into becoming entitlement and oppressiveness, control, whatnot. And so that way, what it means is, you don't have to ask whose side is she on. We can encourage and support men in their innate knowledge of what it means to be the good man. By the way, that's a better strategy than accusing men of being toxic. Why not be positive? Why not tap into their inherent knowledge of what it means to be the good man? And while at the same time, maybe being able to think critically about the more secular definitions of masculinity that are out there, the Andrew Tate masculinity that unfortunately has become very popular with young men today. How can we, support one while being critical of the other one?
Yeah, pausing on Tate. I think it's unfortunate, but not surprising, that a lot of big-time podcasters are rushing to have Andrew Tate on because they're going to get a lot more followers from that. They're going to get a lot more audience from that. So I've listened to a good bit of Tate and the various people who've had him on, and very interesting character. But yeah, wow, what a distortion of what masculinity, and especially godly masculinity, ought to be. But I'm afraid he's become a role model for a whole lot of young men, hasn't he?
Yes. I just heard from a former graduate student of mine who now teaches at a Christian classical school. All our boys are fans of Andrew Tate.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
and Christian classical school.
Yeah, take away their phones and iPads.
Yeah. Or the positive is construct and communicate a biblical view of masculinity
There you go.
that is strong. Well, the good men, honor, integrity, sacrifice. In fact, let me give you another study, because one of the things I find that's unique about my book is that I do a lot of studies from secular thinkers. It's 'cause most writers writing books on masculinity, sort of devotional or Christian living books, and mine is very fact based. So here's another study. This was done by an anthropologist, and again, it was global. It was the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. Again, not a Christian. And what he found is that no matter how they defined masculinity, because it does differ from culture to culture, all cultures have the expectation that the good man will perform what he calls the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. In other words, become a father, build into the next generation.
That's everywhere, huh?
And I thought, yes, it's global. And I thought, there it is again. Once again, we're seeing that men have an inherent innate knowledge that their unique masculine strengths, because they are bigger, stronger, faster than women, but their unique masculine strengths are not given them just to get whatever they want, but are given them to provide for, protect, and take care of the
For
people
the benefit
that
of.
they love.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I would call this, maybe to give another theological term, it's general revelation. General revelation is what we know just from looking around at creation, as opposed to special revelation is the Bible. But, Paul says we can look in Romans 1. He says, we should be able to look at creation and learn some things about God and what he expects of us just from general revelation. And I think these studies sort of underscore that men everywhere understand what masculinity is meant to be. And Romans 2, too, right? 'Cause we all have a conscience, not just Christians. We all have a conscience. So I think it underscores that Paul was absolutely right.
Yes, amen. So you also note in the book that, and I think we all kind of know this because we live in this world, men are falling behind in education. We were hearing that a lot, seeing it a lot. It seems to be the truth. Falling behind in employment, falling behind in health, and even in life expectancy. I think men have long lived shorter lives than women. That wasn't a good sentence. Long lived shorter. Anyway, but it's becoming worse. So these seem to be some of the real problems men are facing, falling behind in education, employment, health, life expectancy. But it doesn't seem like there's any project to make that better. Why are people ignoring that now?
Yeah, exactly. I do go through a lot of the statistics in the book, on how boys are falling behind from kindergarten. This is so sad. They don't have as good fine motor control, and so they can't operate a scissors as well from the
That
time
was
they're
me.
and all the way through. And I don't think most people realize that at the college level, there are now more women than men going to college. The average college now is 60% female and 40% male. In fact, when I started at Houston Baptist University, we were 70-30, which is not so unusual for smaller colleges.
70 men or 70 women?
70 women.
You were?
Mm-hmm,
huh.
mm-hmm.
Have you attracted more men since then?
Yes. So here's what we did. We started a football team.
Uh-huh.
Even before the team started, when we just announced it, the number of male students started to go up.
That's crazy.
And we started an engineering department.
Oh yeah, there you go.
So
good moves.
These were to bring in more men, and we are, slowly we are starting to see a better balance. Schools like Harvard are actually instituting affirmative action to attract more male students because they don't want to go.
Interesting.
Isn't that? I mean,
Yeah.
they're being quiet about it.
Uh-huh.
But there's been a couple of articles on it. So, yeah, they don't want to go beyond 60-40. And you know why? I recently did read an article on it, and it said, it's not that these Ivy League schools care about men. It's that they know women will stop coming.
If there aren't guys.
And there aren't any guys there.
Oh, that's pretty good.
So, and graduate school, there's more women than men in graduate school. There are more women than men even in professional schools like law and medicine. And then after school, like you just mentioned, men are more likely to commit suicide, be drug addicted, to be homeless, to be in mental hospital, to be in prison. 95% of prison inmates are male. And actually the life expectancy thing, you said, that's been for a long time. Actually, it has not been for a long time. Women used to die in childbirth.
Oh, that's true. If you factor that in, you're right.
If you go that far back, right?
Yes.
If you go that far back.
I read that back in like Victorian England, if you were an uppity family, before giving birth to a child, a woman would like set her affairs in order, make sure, whatever she had to take care, because she just knew I might not make it through this.
That's true. I write about that in my book, actually. That yes, make sure you have a will before you go into the childbirth. You have a will. In fact, some women would actually have their child on their shroud, the shroud that they would be buried in. They would use that as the sheet that they lay on.
Take the baby up and wrap me up and to
make it a little easier. Yeah, so dying in childbirth was a major factor, of course, in women dying. Many men had 2 or 3 wives, not because they divorced, but because the wives died.
Yeah.
What was it? The statistic was enormously high in the colonial era here in America. It was something like 1 out of 5 women died in childbirth. So all that to say,
thank God for modern medicine.
Yes. In recent years, male life expectancy has gone down while women stayed the same. So it's not a general trend.
Now, why, Nancy?
Well, let me give you a quote first. There's a magazine called The New Scientist that said the major demographic factor in early death now is being male. Well, 2 reasons. A lot of them are deaths of despair. In other words, drug addiction. The opioid crisis, really hit men. And why did it hit men? Because so many of our working class jobs were outsourced, right?
Right.
Factories were shutting down. Men were out of work. Unemployment does a real number on men. It's very, very hard for men who, like we just said, they intrinsically know that they're meant to provide and protect.
Yep.
And when that's taken away from them, of course they're going to be depressed. And doctors were handing out opioids like candy. There is something, they bear some responsibility as well. And then I've had people say, well, how do they afford it? Medicare. We're paying for it. We're paying for these men to kill themselves, and taxpayer money. That was a real shock when I read that. Or their mother's
paying for it while they live in her basement and play video games all day, every day.
Exactly. So unemployment, speaking of unemployment, many of us haven't realized how bad it is because it doesn't show up in the unemployment numbers when they stop looking for work. So researchers had to dig a little deeper. And what they're now telling us is that male unemployment is at Depression era levels. That was a shock. We remember the Depression, from our history books. It's at Depression era levels. And so I think that's why there's so much homelessness, despair, drug addiction.
But it's not,
and crime even.
It's not, is it? It's not that there aren't jobs out there, because everywhere I go out there, they're hiring and can't find anybody to hire. So are these men who just don't want to work because they're depressed, disillusioned, no vision?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And sometimes they think the jobs are beneath them.
Yeah.
There are certainly a number of men who won't take those really low-level, entry-level jobs. And that's sad, because I think that in my view, you should be willing to take whatever job is out there. That your commitment to, especially if you have a family, your commitment to supporting your family should be greater than your concern over shame, over taking a job that you think is, beneath you. But yeah, it's the, I also think there's something to be said for having been attacked as toxic for a long time. There was a study done just a couple of years ago where half of American men, just under half of American men said they agreed with the statement, these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. And there was a study shortly after that. That one's in the book. There was a more recent one, so it's not in the book, but it was in Britain. And it was 55% of men. So even more than half of men agreed with this. And I quote a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, the young men coming into my practice are increasingly demoralized, defeated, because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. So I think that is undercutting men's motivation as well. Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institution just wrote a book called Of Boys and Men, and he highlighted an education program in Michigan where donors said, we will pay for students, I think if they had a certain grade level, to go to college. We will pay for them. Who signed up? Girls. Who didn't sign up? Boys. And Richard Reeves, as a researcher, said, now what's going on here? There's something deeper happening, because when they were given an opportunity, they would not take it. There's something happening to their underlying motivation and morale and confidence. And we've got to dig deeper than just giving them more opportunities. And I'll give you one more quote too on this, because I think it's relevant. A teacher wrote this, and I quote her in my book. She said, when girls were behind, which was not that long ago, Title IX was for girls, and 1994, the Gender Equity Act poured millions of dollars into equity workshops and gender, girl-friendly curriculum and so on. There's been nothing like that for boys. And so this teacher said, reflecting what she's getting, in the world of teachers, she said, when girls were behind boys, we said, well, it's the system, it's discrimination against girls. Now that boys are falling behind, we say it's their fault.
It's because, yes.
For being too masculine. That's what she said. It's boys' fault because, because of their masculinity, they won't sit still, they won't pay attention, they're too aggressive, blah, blah, blah. So she said, we're blaming boys for their masculinity. For girls, we said, we need to help them. For boys, nobody's saying we need to help them. In fact, when they did try to start programs, Christina Hoff Sommers was a person she's a philosopher, and she wrote the first book on the subject several years ago. You probably read it. It's called The War Against Boys.
No, I did not read that.
You'll like it. It was the first book on this subject. There's been several more. The trouble with boys, why boys fail. I list several of them in my book. But she said we tried to start programs for boys, and they were always opposed. There was always some sense that this is a zero-sum game, and if we help boys, we're going to start leaving girls behind. And so she reported a lot of attempts to help boys, to have programs that were focused on boys, and they were always shut down. So, by feminists, yes. Mostly. I mean, her book was titled "The War Against Boys: How Feminism." She had feminism in the subtitle. She reissued the book, and she got rid of the word feminism. Okay.
Getting out of trouble for that one. So I have a question for you. And that is, so college is increasingly unbelievably expensive. I know you're an academic, and I'm not trying to say you all are bad, but it's gotten really expensive, unbelievably expensive. Like my wife and I have 4 sons. They all went to school, and we helped pay for that. And if I had to do that today, wow, like how would you put 4 boys through college today? And I know lots of guys who are electricians, plumbers, whatever. I know them from the gym. We talk, and some of them are making really good money being electricians. So if I was raising boys today, I might be more inclined to send them into a trade rather than go to university, get corrupted, get a degree, get a job, and so on. Is that some of what's happening, why there are fewer guys going to the university now, or does that not really play into it?
I wish it did. Actually, I wish it did. I wish more boys were going into vocational training. I mentioned Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institution because he's written the most recent book on the subject. And he writes about this, and he says, why have we've gotten rid of vocational training in the high schools? We don't have we don't have what was it called? Shop. We don't have shop anymore.
Yes.
We don't have auto mechanics. That used to be sometimes in even in high school level. And he writes about the need to bring back vocational training. We've had a tendency. Our education system has said everyone should go to college.
Just go to college. Yeah.
Everyone needs to go to college, and you have to realize other cultures don't do that. Even Western cultures. Like I mentioned earlier, I lived in Europe for a while. I was in Germany. And a very small percentage of people go to college. Only people who want a highly academic
And not
training.
a lot of boys are suited for college pursuits, right? I mean, some are, but...
Yeah. Well, I was trying to think of in my college, my class back in Germany. So I was there twice. And the second time I was in their junior college is included in the high school. So I was in junior college over there. And it was roughly half and half, boys and girls. But they have very rich vocational programs. So most students go off to vocational schools, boys and girls.
And girls
Girls will go into being a teller, or an administrative assistant, or, those kind of vocations. And all of the places of business have apprenticeships. So the vast majority of kids go off to apprenticeships where they learn on the job. Mm-hmm. And they get a good job, as you mentioned. Often it's a very good job when they come out. But that's the majority. The majority go to vocational training.
Interesting.
Only a small minority say, yeah, but I'm kind of an abstract thinker. I need to go to college. It's a very small minority. So I think we've got it backwards here. We think everyone should go to college, even though, you're right. Personality tests show that the majority of people are more concrete thinkers, and it's a fairly small minority who are abstract thinkers. And so, yeah, Richard Reeves and others, because he's at the Brookings Institution, I hope people listen to him. He's got some status there because he's really arguing for more vocational training for boys. And it's a very, very realistic way of helping young men, I think.
So my wife and I were blessed to have 13 grandchildren now, and a number of them are boys. So one of our sons has 5 boys. The oldest is 17. They're looking in the face now of where's he going, what's he doing, and I'm really interested to see. I'm seeking to maintain my correct place, stay out of their decisions and all that, But I'm interested to see how they're going to go. It's a different world from when I was a kid. You just went to college, pretty much. Yeah.
Well, I have to tell you, since you asked about my personal life, my oldest son is at Google, and he managed to finish 1 year of college. He's had 1 year of college. Huh. So even white-collar professions, some of them are based on what you can do.
Very much.
Not on your degrees. So I'll tell you how he got a job at Google. He did not apply. He was contributing to open source software. So he had gone to Virginia Tech, and he dropped out because even Virginia Tech was not challenging enough for him. He didn't like it. He dropped out and so managed to finish up the first year at a community college. So he did get 1 year, but he was contributing to open source software. And Google, this is how they find people. They go and look at open source software, and they say, hey, this guy can code.
Yeah,
hey,
let's get him.
Code. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
So they call him and say, hey, you want to work for Google?
Yeah,
so
I've seen Elon Musk hiring for SpaceX, and the ad says at the bottom, college doesn't matter. They want to know, what can you do? What do you know? What's your talent? Are you energized? And so on.
Yes, it's the same with music, for example. What can you do? I play the violin. Who cares about degrees? come and play. Let's see how you can do. So there are a number of fields, and not just sort of, remember the program Dirty Jobs?
Oh, yeah. That's fun.
That was,
What's
that
his
was
name?
such a
Mike
great
Rowe?
program.
Yeah. In fact, isn't he a believer? I think he's a brother in Christ. Yeah.
I think so. Right, right. But it was a fascinating program because it was saying, hey, these are the kind of jobs, hands-on, tough, challenging jobs that men are especially suited for. But there are some white-collar jobs too that you don't need a degree for. It's what you can do.
Yes.
And hopefully, more and more businesses, industries will start to have tests where you can come, take the test, and show what you can do, as opposed to get in there
regardless of degree.
Yeah. And by the way, my second son's a science editor, and it was kind of the same thing. Editing jobs, they always have a test for you. Here's a piece of literature with all kinds of mistakes in it. Let's see what you can do to fix it.
That's good. Proof is in the pudding.
Mm-hmm. That's how you get an editing job.
Well, I'm going to move on to a little bit different question. This comes up in a section in your book, and your book says that the Darwinian theory of evolution, which is pretty much still everywhere, normalized many traits in men that are today labeled toxic. Darwinian theory of evolution normalized them. Today they're considered toxic. How is that? How so?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. This is one of my favorite chapters because most of us think of evolution in terms of genes and fossils and so on, and we don't realize how much it shaped the secular script for masculinity. So in my book, I do go through several stages of how the secular script developed, because I'm an apologist at heart, right? So I want to show why the secular world gets its view of masculinity so wrong. And this is one of the key turning points. Darwinian thinkers began to say that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would have to be the men who were ruthless, rugged, brutal, savage, barbarian, and even predatory. And so, whereas Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them, Darwinian thinkers began to urge men to live down to their animal nature, their presumed animal nature, to the beast within, as they often put it. And by the way, Darwin himself also did argue explicitly that women are intellectually inferior. So he bears some responsibility for that as well. And by the way, Herbert Spencer, we have to talk about him too, because he was the main popularizer of Darwinism here in America. And he literally said, if men are so brutal and savage, how do women get along with them? And so he said, women had to learn the ability to please. And it would also help if they learned to hide their resentment at such bad treatment.
Sounds like a wonderful marriage.
That was a message of evolution, apparently. Men are brutal beasts, and women have to learn to hide their resentment at being treated so badly. So, and here's the important point is that was called social Darwinism. And it has come back in our own day. It's under a new label. It's called evolutionary psychology. But it's basically the same thing, which is, let's take a cue from evolution. And I'll give you two examples that I give in the book is a best-selling book. So, it had a lot of influence, a best-selling book called The Moral Animal. And he said, the human male is a possessive, oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving men a book on how to have a better marriage is like giving a Viking a book on how not to pillage.
Wow.
And I say, wait a minute. These men are promoting a more toxic, more negative view of men than even the most radical feminists are. Wait a minute. And then another one is a book that it's an older book, but it was just reissued by George Gilder. And he too says men are by nature violent, sexually promiscuous, irresponsible. What are some of his other adjectives? He goes on and on about unless there's a woman to tame them. So that's his ultimately, he says women have to tame these men
That's the
because
woman's
they're just
job. Tame him. Tame the beast.
to civilize them. To which my question is, if men really are so violent and brutal as he says, what woman would have the power to tame them?
Yeah.
Men are stronger. And what woman would want to, for that matter? But I think he's assuming that that women have this power to tame, this man who's brutal and violent. I'm sorry, but he's not paying attention to the domestic violence statistics. Men who are like that generally are not very tameable. But anyway, the main point, though, is that this is the message still from evolutionary thinkers, even in our own day. And I suggest, like you said, it normalizes traits and says, well, this is just, these aren't negative traits. They're normative traits for men. This is just the male character. And what I say in the book is they're letting men off the hook. They're saying, well, we're not even going to try to hold you to a higher standard. We're not going to even try to hold you to some standard of moral accountability. We're just going to say, oh, well, you're naturally this way. George Gilder goes so far as to say, men have to follow the women's morality. To which I say, no, they need to follow God's morality. What man is going to follow women's morality? No red-blooded man is going to want to do that.
Well,
that
this sounds like early feminism back in the, say, 1800s and in the Prohibition era a little bit later, where it was the job of the woman to tame the man. And some of those men, there was a lot of alcoholism and stuff. There were problems, but the woman's job was to tame the beast and put up with him to a certain extent. And what men would go along with that? Not many. That didn't go very good. That whole project didn't work.
No, and that's why we got, the history there is that, in the 19th century, for the first time in human history, women were said to be morally and spiritually superior to men.
Yes.
And that, we need to stop for a moment on that, because all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people had thought that men were morally stronger, morally superior. They thought that the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight, and that men were more rational, and therefore men were more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue comes from the Latin word for man. Vir means man, as in the word virile.
Yeah.
So the word virtue actually had overtones of masculine strength and honor. So it was a completely new thing when in the 19th century, women were said to be morally superior and set up to be sort of the moral guardians of society. And even that, why did that happen? Well, after the Industrial Revolution, there developed a very large public realm, right, of business, industry, financial institutions, universities, and the state. And people began to say that these large public institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. Like we hear today, right? Don't bring your private values into the public realm. Well, in that case, where would values be cultivated? In the private realm. And who would cultivate them? Well, women, because women were still in the private realm. So that's how that happened, is that in a sense, men were working in that secular realm. They were getting that secular education, and men were growing more secular. And so that's why, in a sense, men were no longer being bound as much by a Christian ethic. They were not going to churches often. You see this in the literature of the time, by the way. People began to complain that men were growing more secular. Men were trying to straddle it, in a sense, with a sacred secular split, right? So they would operate by secular principles at work and come home and try to be a Christian again, which didn't work. There's one writer in the 19th century who said men are sort of caught in a fatal dualism. That was her term, fatal dualism. And of course, it doesn't work. As you train yourself in secular thinking, then that overcomes it. People began to complain that men were making an idol out of work. Before the Industrial Revolution, when men worked side by side with their wives and children on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so men's work was very much framed as caretaking. You're doing this because you're responsible for your family. And then after the Industrial Revolution, when men, what it did is take work out of the home, right?
Yes.
And men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And actually, that's when you first start to see negative language describing the male character because people began to protest that they were losing that caretaking ethos of the colonial era, that they were becoming self-centered, egocentric, ambitious, greedy and acquisitive, look out for number one, win at all costs. This was the language of the day. And of course, complaining also that they were losing their Christian ethic and making an idol out of work. So naturally, what happened is, getting back to your question, women said, well, if we're supposed to be moral guardians of society, then it's it's up to us to go out into the public square and start reform movements to overcome the alcoholism, the prostitution, sex trafficking, gambling, crime. All of these sort of traditionally male vices were increasing. Why? Because men were more secular. And so there was a huge increase on sort of these, what we might call traditionally male vices. And then that explains why there was also a lot of reform movements. But the reform movements were mostly driven by women. And so that conflict between men and women was sort of set up at that time.
That had a lot to do, I believe, with churches becoming more feminized, too. It was more women who were leading things. But rather than jump into that, we are running out of time. I want to thank you for being here today. This has been wonderful. It's been marvelous. I want to show your book again. This is it, The Toxic War on Masculinity, subtitle, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Couple more things, quick. So one is just give us a brief summary. What's this book about? Why did you write it? What problem were you trying to solve? What did you hope to accomplish? What's the book for?
Yeah, the final decision to write it was when I ran into the social science data showing that Christian men do so much better than any other group in America. I said, we need to get that out to encourage Christian men. And that was the final reason. I mean, I looked at other things. I had written a little bit about the Industrial Revolution in my earlier book, Total Truth, but I applied it there mostly to how it affected women. And I thought, I'm not going to write about women again, because there are whole libraries of books on women's history because of the feminist movement. There's almost nothing on men. I found really two good histories of men in America. And then there were some histories on related topics like the history of fatherhood and so on. But I thought, wow, this is a perspective that's not out there. Both the secular perspective from these history books, but even more importantly, the Christian perspective is really not out there. And so that's the ultimate reason I wanted to write it, was to encourage men who are living out their faith that they're actually doing very well. And really maybe two things. The church has to support them, but how does the church reach out to those nominal men who are claiming the identity of evangelical, but who are actually doing worse than secular men? I think we really need to rethink how to disciple these men and help bring them in and help them to have a biblical understanding of headship and submission. Because right now they're taking the language, but infusing those words with secular meanings and then claiming to be Christian. So they're skewing the statistics.
Yes, very much so.
It does help show us what the church has to do to encourage one group and to disciple the other group better.
Very good. Thank you. So I'm telling everybody listening, you can get this book on Amazon, of course. You can get almost any book on Amazon. I have mixed emotions about Amazon. I buy books from them all the time, and yet I kind of hate it. You know what I mean? Like, I'd rather buy from a little local shop down the street, but they're all gone because there's the giant Amazon. But anyway, I didn't need to go into that, but I did. You can get this book on Amazon. But Nancy, there are probably other ways people can connect with you, a website or what. Tell us about them, would you?
Yes. And by the way, if you hate Amazon, you can go to christianbook.com.
Touche. Thank you.
Yeah, because I like you, I'm always a little guilty going into Amazon. But my publisher very generously gave me a brand new website. So you should come over and look at it. It's colorful and fun. And you can browse my other books. You mentioned my earlier book, Total Truth. So you can browse that and you can, read the endorsements and you can leave a comment. There's a place to leave a comment. So that would be fun. I don't get the chance to answer them all, but I do read them all. So come on over and say hi. Oh, I forgot to say the name, nancypearcey.com. And Pearcey is Pearcey.
EY, yes.
Right. NancyPearcey.com. So, yeah, come on over and say hi.
Well, thank you for coming on over and saying hi here on the Grounded podcast today. It's been a real pleasure. Hope to have you again someday. And that's all for today. So thank you all, your listeners for joining us today on Grounded. Grounded comes out twice a month on all the major platforms. You already know that because you're hearing this on one of them. So thank you for joining us. Hope to have you again.